never thought I'd walk in on something like that. It was supposed to be just another regular day, a quiet evening at home. But what I witnessed that night changed everything. I was heading upstairs to call Mira for dinner, her familiar, bright voice and soft footsteps echoing from behind her door. I had no reason to think anything was out of the ordinary, but the door was slightly open, just enough for me to catch a glimpse. A part of me wishes I hadn't looked, that I had turned back. But curiosity got the best of me. Inside the room, the air felt heavy with something I couldn't quite identify, a tension that made my stomach tighten and my palms start to sweat. And then I saw them, Miranda and Ethan, too close, too intimate. It wasn't just the way they were standing. There was something in their posture, the way her hand rested on his arm so casually, how his eyes lingered on her face with a focus I'd never seen before. My mind was scrambling to make sense of it all. For a split second I thought maybe it was nothing, just an innocent moment I had misinterpreted. But then it happened. Their lips met, slow at first, hesitant, like they were testing the waters. The air was thick with tension, as if they knew they shouldn't be doing this. As if the gravity of what they were doing hadn't fully hit them. But it was real. It was happening right there, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. My chest tightened and I felt the heat rise in my face. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to do. This wasn't just a kiss. It was something deeper, more than a fleeting moment of attraction. It felt like I was watching a secret unfold, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for a long time, finally bubbling over. The worst part? They had no idea I was standing there, witnessing everything. Miranda's eyes darted toward the window, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "We have to be careful." Ethan nodded, his face flushed, lingering too close to her, unwilling to let the moment slip away. I backed away, my heart racing, my thoughts spiraling. I had to leave. I needed space to think. It felt like I had walked into a scene I wasn't meant to see. A private moment that shattered the fragile sense of peace I thought we had in our home. Miranda, the woman who had brought warmth and stability back to our lives, had just kissed Ethan, someone we considered family. Felt wrong. Deeply wrong. But I didn't know how to deal with that feeling. I slipped away before they could notice, my legs trembling as I made my way down the stairs. My mind was racing, unable to focus on anything but what I had just seen. What would my dad think? What would he do if he found out? Should I tell him? Or keep it to myself? The questions were relentless, swirling in my mind like a storm. Each question seemed more urgent than the last. At the dinner table I tried to act normal, but it felt like the walls were closing in around me. Calm down. But Miranda seemed perfectly fine. A few minutes later, she was as calm and composed as ever, smiling at me like nothing had happened. The same smile I had seen 1,000 times before, and it sent a chill through me. How could she act like everything was fine? I wanted to scream, to confront her, but the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, silent, caught between anger and confusion. Ethan didn't join us for dinner, which I was thankful for. I couldn't bear to look at him. The memory of their kiss was still too fresh, too raw. I couldn't trust myself to stay calm if I saw them together again. As I ate, the weight of what I'd seen began to sink in. This wasn't a mistake I could just brush off. This was a betrayal. But what could I do? I felt trapped. If I told my dad, everything would fall apart. He'd already been through so much. Losing my mom, trying to rebuild our lives. Miranda had been a big part of that, the one who had helped us move forward to bring light back into the house. And now? Now this. How could I destroy the fragile peace we had left? I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes I saw them, Miranda and Ethan, locked in that moment, unaware of everything around them. I replayed it over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out how things had gone so wrong. But there were no answers, only a growing sense of dread. It felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to fall into something I couldn't control. The next morning, Miranda acted as if nothing had changed. She laughed, chatted with my dad, made breakfast like she always did. It was like the night before had never happened. But for me, everything had shifted. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. Every word she spoke, every smile she gave felt like a lie. The facade she was putting on for my dad for me was so thin and I could see right through it. I wanted to confront her, demand answers. But I didn't know how. How do you start a conversation like that? How do you tell someone you know their secret? That you saw something you weren't supposed to see? I couldn't. So I stayed quiet, watching, waiting, unsure of what to do next. Trapped in my own silence, it felt suffocating. Days passed and I kept replaying that moment. Every time Miranda spoke to me, every time she smiled at my dad, I felt that knot in my stomach. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that I had misunderstood. But deep down I knew better. The tension between Miranda and Ethan was undeniable. Yet everything on the surface seemed fine. A Thursday evening rolled around, and Ethan showed up at the house again. My dad had been called out of town for a work trip, so it was just Miranda and me. She had invited Ethan over to help with some repairs in the garage, something about a broken shelf. I tried to ignore it, but as soon as he walked in I could feel it. A shift in the air. It was subtle, but I sensed it, like the calm before the storm. I retreated to my room, trying to stay away from whatever was unfolding downstairs. But my curiosity was overwhelming. I couldn't just sit there, pretending everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. Quietly I slipped downstairs, trying to be as discreet as possible so they wouldn't hear me. The garage door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to peek through unnoticed. They were standing way too close to each other, too close for comfort. And Noah was talking to Ethan. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, as if she didn't want anyone else to overhear. I tried to make out what she was saying, but the low hum of the evening drowned her words out. And then, just like before, it happened again. Ethan leaned in, and before I could even process it, their lips met. This time it was quicker, more certain, like they'd done it before. They didn't pull away right away, and that familiar sinking feeling came rushing back. I stepped away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest, struggling to understand what I had just seen. How could they do this right in front of me? Why were they risking everything? I retreated to the stairs and sat down, my head in my hands. I didn't want to be there anymore. I didn't want to know what else was going on. It felt like I was stuck in a nightmare, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wake up. I wanted to confront them, stop this before it got worse, but I didn't know how to even begin. A few minutes later I heard them laughing downstairs. It was casual, like nothing had happened. I quickly stood up, hoping to get to my room before they came out of the garage. I didn't want them to realize I'd been listening. But just as I turned to leave, the door opened and there they were. Our eyes met for a split second, long enough for me to see that she knew. She knew I'd seen it, but she didn't say a word. Instead she smiled, as if everything was perfectly fine. "Hey, we're going to order dinner. Want to join us?" she asked, her voice light, like it was just any other evening. I shook my head, mumbling something about not being hungry, and hurried upstairs. I couldn't trust myself to be in the same room with them after what I had just witnessed. Back in my room I tried to gather my thoughts. What was I supposed to do now? I had seen them kiss twice, and each time it felt like the ground beneath me was slipping away. This wasn't a mistake. This was something bigger, something dangerous. And I was the only one who knew. The weight of that truth pressed on me, and I felt completely alone. I could hear them downstairs talking and laughing like nothing was wrong, and it made me sick to my stomach. How could they do this? She was supposed to be the one holding our family together, helping Dad after Mom passed. And now this. I didn't know who to trust anymore. Hours passed, and the house eventually grew quiet. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. I considered telling Dad everything, but the thought of it made me hesitate. How would that even look? How could I tell him that his wife, the woman he trusted, was betraying him? And with Ethan, no less, someone he considered part of the family. The more I thought about it, the more complicated it seemed. I was torn between wanting to protect my dad and the fear of what telling him might do. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But how much longer could I keep quiet? As I lay there, I heard footsteps outside my room. The door creaked open, and I saw a sliver of light from the hallway. It was her. She stood there for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to come in. My heart raced and my mind spun with possibilities. But then, without saying anything, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the door long after she left, trying to figure out what her silence meant. Did she know I was about to tell someone? Or was she as lost in this mess as I was? I had no answers, just more questions, and time was running out to figure it all out. After that night, things in the house started to shift. First, it wasn't obvious. There was just this underlying tension, something you could feel but not see. It was like a current running beneath the surface, ready to break. And Ethan acted like nothing had happened, like they hadn't crossed a line. But I knew better. Every time they were in the same room, I felt that same tightness in my chest, that same discomfort. One weekend, Dad suggested we take a trip to the family cabin. It was a small, cozy place deep in the woods by a lake, where we used to go all the time when I was younger. Back when things were simpler. Before everything got so complicated. I wasn't exactly excited about the trip, but Dad seemed to be looking forward to it. Maybe he thought it would be a chance for us to reconnect, to escape the stress that had been hanging over us at home. The drive up was long and silent. Dad tried to make conversation, but it felt forced. Noah sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her face unreadable. I sat in the back, pretending to sleep, though my mind was racing the whole time. I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, about the way Noah had kissed him, and about the secret between them growing like a shadow. I had this nagging feeling that something was about to happen. When we finally arrived at the cabin, the air was cool and crisp, and the scent of pine filled my lungs. The cabin itself hadn't changed much over the years. It was still small and rustic, with wooden beams and a stone fireplace. The kind of place that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. Dad unloaded the car while Noah wandered down to the lake, her figure small against the vastness of the water. I watched her from the porch, a strange sense of unease settling over me. I couldn't tell if it was the cabin, the isolation, or the weight of everything I knew but hadn't said. Either way, I felt like I was on the edge of something, like the ground beneath me was about to give way. That evening, after we settled in and had dinner, Dad suggested we all sit by the fireplace, just like we used to do every year. I nodded, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I tried to go with the flow, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that none of this was real. We sat there, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, but the silence between us felt suffocating, like it was pressing down on me. My dad kept looking at Noah, like she was the only thing keeping him from falling apart, and every time his gaze lingered on her, my stomach twisted. At some point, my dad got a call from work. He sighed, clearly annoyed, but stepped outside to take it. As soon as he was gone, the air in the room shifted. I could feel Noah's eyes on me, and when I glanced up I saw it. This invisible tension hanging between us, thick and undeniable. She wasn't smiling now. Her face was stiff, her body tense, like she was preparing herself for something. "Are you all right?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why I bothered. Maybe I just wanted to break the silence, to take some of the weight off my chest that had been building ever since the night before. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared at the fire, lost in thought. "I know you've seen things," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Things you shouldn't have." My throat tightened. There it was, the thing we'd both been avoiding. I thought about pretending I didn't know what she meant, but that felt pointless. We both knew the truth. "You kissed him," I said, my voice flat and steady. "Twice." She shut her eyes for a second, like she was trying to shut out what I had just said. When she opened them again, her expression was different, broken even, and it made my heart sink. "It's not what you think," she said quietly, but her words felt hollow. "Then what is it?" I asked, not really expecting an answer. She turned to me, looked me straight in the eyes, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her gaze. Maybe regret. Maybe guilt. "It's complicated," she finally said, her voice trembling. "Your dad. He's a good man. He doesn't deserve any of this." I felt a lump form in my throat, and my chest tightened. "Then why? Why would you do this?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up abruptly and started toward the door. "I need some air," she mumbled, brushing past me without saying another word. I stayed there, staring at the fire, my mind spinning. What had just happened? What was I supposed to do with all of this? Her words didn't make anything clearer. If anything, they made it worse. My head was filled with questions, but none of them had answers. When my dad returned, I thought about telling him everything. The truth was right there on the tip of my tongue, threatening to spill out. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear him apart like that. Not yet. So I stayed silent, pretending that everything was fine, even though deep down I knew nothing would ever be the same again. That night sleep didn't come. The weight of everything was too much. and the quiet of the cabin felt like a suffocating blanket. I lay in bed, listening to the wind rustling through the trees outside, the faint sound of the lake gently lapping at the shore in the distance. Noah was out there, alone with her thoughts, and I was left alone with mine, the questions circling endlessly, unanswered. The next morning the cabin felt eerily still. My dad had left early to grab some groceries from a nearby town, leaving me and Noah alone. The tension between us from the night before was still hanging there, thick and uncomfortable. I could feel it in every glance, every breath. Noah hadn't said a word since our conversation by the fire, and I wasn't sure if she was avoiding me or if she just didn't know what to say. Either way, the silence was unbearable. I decided to step outside for a bit, hoping the fresh air would help clear my mind. The lake was calm, its surface smooth like glass, reflecting the trees and the sky above. I walked along the shoreline, the cold morning air sharp against my skin. Felt good. Almost like a release. It gave me something to focus on other than the tangled mess in my head. I hadn't gone far when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Noah. She had followed me. Her presence felt as heavy as the questions swirling in my mind. She didn't say anything at first, just walked beside me in silence, her gaze fixed on the water. I waited, unsure of what I was hoping for. Unsure if I even wanted to hear what she had to say. Last night, she began, her voice soft, tentative. I didn't mean to leave things like that. I stopped walking and turned to face her, my heart thudding in my chest. You didn't explain anything, I said, my voice more even than I felt. You just walked away. Noah exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly, like the weight of it all was starting to settle in. I know, she said, her eyes dropping to the ground. I don't know how to explain it. Not in a way that makes sense. Try, I said, my voice firmer than I meant. I deserve that much, at least for a moment. She didn't say anything. Her eyes were still on the lake, her face distant, like she was trying to find the right words but couldn't. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, fragile. Your dad. He's a good man. He's done everything for me, for you. And I care about him. I really do. But there are some things that can't be fixed. Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. So what? You just turned to Ethan instead? How does that make any sense? Noah flinched at the sharpness in my voice, but she didn't back down. It's not about him, she said, shaking her head. It's not about Ethan. It's about me. I don't know how to explain it. I don't even know if I understand it myself. I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. It felt like she was avoiding the real issue, dancing around the truth. What are you trying to say? I demanded, my frustration bubbling over. This thing with you and Ethan. It doesn't matter that it's not real. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment her eyes were filled with something I couldn't name. It's real, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. But it's also wrong. I've always known that. But sometimes you make choices that you can't undo. And then you're stuck. You're stuck living with what you've done. Her words hung between us, heavy and suffocating. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know what to say. A part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her how selfish she was, how much she was hurting my dad, hurting me. But another part of me, the guilt in her eyes, the regret in her voice, it all hit me like a weight I couldn't carry. I couldn't bring myself to say anything harsh. So instead I just asked, what now? After a long silence. What happens next? Noah shook her head, her face twisted in pain. I don't know, she whispered. I really wish I did, but I don't. I'm so sorry. Her apology hung in the air, flat and empty, not quite matching the enormity of what had happened. But what else could she say? What more was there to offer? I didn't reply. I just turned and kept walking along the shore, leaving her standing there, alone. I needed distance. I needed time to process it all, everything. The cabin, the lake, Noah. It was all too much for me to handle at once. When I finally made it back to the cabin, my dad was unloading the groceries. When he saw me, he gave me a warm smile. One of those smiles that made everything seem okay, like the world hadn't turned upside down. I forced a smile back, but it didn't feel right. It felt like something inside me had shifted, like I was playing a part in some twisted version of reality. We spent the rest of the day pretending pretending everything was normal, pretending we were just a family on a relaxing trip. But I could feel the tension simmering under the surface, like a pot about to boil over. My dad didn't notice though. He was too busy trying to keep the weekend light, to make the most of whatever time we had left. Noah. She played her role too, smiling, laughing, acting like nothing had changed, even though we both knew everything had. That evening, as we sat by the fire, my dad started talking about the future. He rambled on about fixing up the cabin, maybe adding a second floor, turning it into a place where we could have family gatherings. He was so animated, so hopeful. His optimism was contagious. But to me it felt like a lie. How could he talk about the future when everything was already falling apart in front of him? I looked at Noah. She was smiling, nodding along, but her eyes told a different story. There was no joy in them, just a quiet resignation, as though she was already living in a world where everything had ended. And maybe it had. The last morning at the cabin seemed almost too calm. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and for a brief moment, it almost felt like we were just another family on a relaxing vacation. But underneath things were unraveling. I could see it in the way Noah wouldn't meet my eyes, in the way her smile was tight when she spoke to my dad. And my dad? He was still oblivious, talking about future plans as though nothing was wrong. I kept telling myself I had to speak up, that I couldn't let this charade continue. But every time I opened my mouth, the words got stuck. What was I supposed to do? How could I be the one to shatter my dad's world? By the afternoon, my dad suggested we take the boat out on the lake, and we all go for a ride. Noah declined, claiming she wasn't feeling well. Part of me wanted to stay behind with her, but I knew I needed to get away, even just for a little while. I needed space to think, to figure out what I was going to do. So I went with my dad. We paddled in silence for a while, the sound of the water lapping against the boat filling the quiet. My dad, ever the optimist, started talking about the cabin again, rambling on about expanding the deck, adding another bedroom. He even joked about one day bringing grandchildren there, making it a family tradition. Inside I was screaming. How could he not see it? How could he not feel the tension? The lies? I stared at the water, watching my reflection ripple and distort beneath the surface. Just like everything else in my life right now, I felt like I was suffocating, like something inside me was about to break. When we finally returned to the cabin, the tension hit me like a brick wall. Noah was sitting on the porch, her face pale, her hands clenched in her lap. She looked up when we approached but quickly turned away, avoiding both of our gazes. My dad, still oblivious as ever, asked if she was feeling better. She nodded, but the tightness in her face told me everything I needed to know. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending. The lie had grown too big, and the weight of it was suffocating. It was tearing me apart from the inside, and I couldn't carry it any longer. I had to tell him. I have to, I thought, even though my heart was racing in my chest. Dad, I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my ears. There's something I need to talk to you about. He looked at me, surprised by the seriousness in my tone. But before he could ask, I saw Noah freeze. Her eyes went wide, her hand tightening around the armrest of her chair, knuckles turning white. The silence between us stretched out, thick and heavy, like something was about to snap. What is it, son? My dad's voice was soft, concerned, but I could barely hear him over the rush of blood in my ears. I opened my mouth, but the words, the truth, caught in my throat. Then, just as I was about to speak, the sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed from the driveway. We all turned instinctively. My stomach dropped. It was Ethan. Of all the times, why now? Ethan stepped out of the car with that familiar confident grin plastered on his face. But I saw it in the way he held himself, his shoulders too stiff, his eyes flicking nervously toward Noah. Something was off. Didn't know you were coming up today, my dad said, his voice light, his smile wide as he walked over to greet him. Ethan shot a quick look at Noah, but she wasn't meeting his gaze. She stared at the ground, her face ashen. I thought I'd swing by, see how you guys were doing, Ethan said, his voice slightly strained. The air around us thickened, charged with something unspoken, something dangerous. It felt like we were all standing on the edge of a cliff, just waiting for something to push us over. I was frozen in place, unsure whether I should speak up or stay quiet. Was this the moment everything would come crashing down? Then, without warning, Noah stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. "I need to talk to Ethan," she said, her voice tight, strained. My dad looked confused. "Talk to him about what?" Noah didn't answer. She just gave a quick gesture toward the door, motioning for Ethan to follow her inside. He hesitated, shooting another glance between her, my dad, and me before he followed her into the cabin. The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving me and my dad standing there alone. My dad turned to me, brow furrowed in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't lie anymore. The truth was pressing against my chest, clawing to get out, and I couldn't hold it back any longer. "Dad," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "I need to tell you something." But before I could say another word, a loud crash came from inside the cabin. We both froze. Our eyes shot to the house. For a split second, everything was still. Then we heard shouting. Noah's voice. Ethan's voice. The words were muffled, but it was clear. Something was happening. Something bad. Without thinking, my dad rushed toward the cabin. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what we were about to walk into. When we reached the door and my dad flung it open, the tension hit us like a brick wall. Noah and Ethan were standing in the middle of the living room, their faces flushed with anger. Their voices were raised, jagged with emotion. "I can't do this anymore," Noah shouted, her voice breaking, raw with frustration. "It's not fair to him. It's not fair to any of us." Ethan's eyes flicked back and forth between Noah and my dad, his face panic-stricken. "Just calm down," he pleaded. But it was too late. The truth was out. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, impossible to ignore. My dad stood frozen, pale, his lips parting in disbelief as he processed what was happening. "You," he whispered, barely audible. Noah turned to him, tears streaking down her face. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice breaking under the weight of her words. "I'm so sorry." My dad didn't respond. He didn't say anything. He just turned and walked out of the cabin, disappearing into the woods without another word, leaving us there in stunned silence. I stood there, numb, watching as everything I had been holding together for so long unraveled in front of me. I wanted to chase after him, to explain, to make him understand, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, staring at the open door, my mind spinning in 1,000 directions, wondering if anything would ever be the same again.